10 gruesome killers with unsettling obsessions. Welcome to Creepshow. Today, we're diving into the minds of killers whose disturbing obsessions drove them far beyond the realms of ordinary crime. These individuals weren't just murderers, they were captivated by bizarre fixations that fueled their violent acts. From fetishistic brutality to unsettling rituals, these stories reveal the darkest corners of human psychology. Join me as we explore 10 gruesome killers with unsettling obsessions that will leave you truly unnerved. Number 10. Matthew Hoffman, Trees. In November 2010, the quiet town of Mount Vernon, Ohio, became the setting for a shocking case that would soon gain national attention. Police had entered the home of 30-year-old Matthew Hoffman to investigate a report of missing persons. What they found inside was something out of a nightmare. The entire house was blanketed in leaves, floors, walls. Every surface was covered. Piles and bags of leaves lined the bathroom, and dense layers filled some rooms so thickly that officers feared they might uncover bodies hidden beneath. The air was thick with decay, and as they cautiously made their way through the house, they couldn't have guessed what awaited them in the basement. There, in a dark corner, they found a 13-year-old girl. She was bound, her wrists tied, and dressed in a makeshift diaper fashioned from a trash bag. She lay on a bed of leaves, shivering, covered in thin blankets. She had been missing for 4 days, taken from her home in the dead of night. The girl was shaken, but coherent. When police freed her, her first words were heartbreaking. She asked if she could go to school, fearing she'd be marked tardy. Then she asked about her dog, who had disappeared along with her. Officers later learned the dog had been killed by Hoffman because it barked too loudly. The girl had no idea just how much horror had unfolded. Days earlier, Hoffman had broken into her home in what he described as a robbery gone wrong. But his actions escalated quickly, leading to unspeakable violence. Hoffman had murdered her mother, Tina Herman, her younger brother, Cody Maynard, and a family friend, Stephanie Sprang, who had been at the house that day. He later dismembered their bodies, carefully disposing of their remains in the hollow of a massive 65-foot tree in a remote wooded area. This act, both grotesque and bizarre, hinted at Hoffman's disturbing fixation. The connection to trees went deeper than the crime scene. Friends and family shared that Hoffman's life had revolved around trees since childhood. They were his obsession, his comfort zone, his escape. He spent countless hours climbing, playing, and hiding in trees. He later worked part-time as a tree trimmer, though he was ultimately let go for falsifying his work history and unnerving his boss. As the investigation unfolded, psychologists began to analyze his motives. His obsession with trees, they theorized, was part of a deep-seated mental imbalance, an attempt to find stability in something he felt he could control. Perhaps, they speculated, that's why he chose to hide his victims in a tree, to merge his crime with the very thing that defined his life. But whatever comfort trees provided, it was warped beyond recognition by Hoffman's monstrous acts. In court, Hoffman confessed to the crimes, showing little remorse. He spoke openly of his actions, the murders, and his twisted rituals involving leaves and trees, leaving no doubt of his guilt. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again have the chance to commit such horrors. Matthew Hoffman's gruesome obsession had led him to unimaginable cruelty, and his case stands as a haunting example of how even the most mundane objects can become symbols of terror in the hands of a disturbed mind. Number 9. Reece Kibbe, cutting women's clothing. Long before he became known as the I-5 Strangler, Reece Kibbe displayed disturbing signs of a dark and twisted mind. As a young boy, he was a frequent ward of the juvenile justice system. Even then, Kibbe stood out for his strange and unsettling behavior. He would often skip school and break into women's homes, stealing undergarments that he would take back to his room, cut into, and mutilate. Using his mother's scissors, he would carve amorphous holes in the fabric, a ritual that would become a disturbing precursor to the horrors he would later commit. Kibbe's juvenile offenses didn't stop there. He was known to break into garages, falsely claiming he'd been kidnapped and molested. His lies and fabrications made it difficult for authorities to understand what was going on inside his mind. One juvenile officer even wondered if the young Kibbe would go on to become a danger to society, though he couldn't have known how prescient that concern would be. Years later, Kibbe validated those early fears in the most horrifying way. Between 1977 and 1987, he terrorized Northern California, targeting women he'd abduct along the highways that crisscrossed the region. The press eventually dubbed him the I-5 Strangler for the long stretches of Interstate 5 where he hunted his victims. Over the course of that decade, Kibbe kidnapped, raped, and murdered at least 7 women, leaving each scene marked by his disturbing signature. His murders echoed his early behavior in chilling ways. Just as he had done as a child, Kibbe cut holes in his victims' clothing. Sometimes he even took a lock of his victim's hair, wrapping it carefully in a piece of her underwear before leaving the scene. Investigators noted these bizarre details, realizing they were dealing with someone whose violence was deeply personal, rooted in rituals that only he understood. For years, Kibbe eluded capture, but his luck ran out in 1987 when he was apprehended and charged in the murder of 17-year-old Darcy Frackenpole. Initially, he was convicted for this single murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. But for the families of other missing women, Darcy's conviction wasn't the end. It was only a fraction of what they believed he was responsible for. Then, in the early 2000s, forensic science caught up with Kibbe. DNA advancements connected him to 6 more murders, each one confirming the horrific patterns that had haunted investigators for years. Faced with the evidence, Kibbe chose to avoid a death sentence by admitting to his crimes. He cooperated with authorities, leading them to the remains of all but one of his victims. Each revelation was a painful confirmation for families who had long awaited answers. Though officially linked to 7 murders, investigators fear that the true count of Kibbe's victims could be much higher. His haunting signature, his obsession with cutting women's clothing, remains one of the most unsettling details of his crimes, a fixation that bridged his early life and his darkest acts. Kibbe's story serves as a disturbing reminder that sometimes even the smallest signs of depravity can hint at something far more terrifying. Number 8. Danilo Restivo, haircutting. In September 1993, a quiet Italian town was forever marked by a mysterious and tragic disappearance. 16-year-old Elisa Claps, a compassionate teenager with a warm heart, agreed to meet an older, awkward man named Danilo Restivo at her local church. Though she had heard unsettling rumors about him, about his strange, fixated behavior, his odd habits of sitting behind women on buses to cut their hair, Elisa felt pity for him. Friends warned her to be cautious, but Elisa chose to give Restivo the benefit of the doubt. Tragically, this decision would be her last. That church meeting became the final time anyone saw Elisa Claps alive. From the beginning, suspicion quickly fell upon Restivo. He was the last person to see her, and his reputation for unsettling conduct was well known. Yet, despite the growing suspicions and Restivo's odd behavior, no body was found, and evidence was lacking. The case stalled, leaving Elisa's family in agony as her disappearance haunted Italy, turning Elisa into one of the nation's most famous missing persons cases. Years passed, and by the early 2000s, Elisa's case had faded into a cold mystery. During this time, Danilo Restivo had quietly resettled in Bournemouth, England, hoping to leave his disturbing past behind. But his obsession persisted, and it was in this new town that he would commit another heinous crime. In 2002, Heather Barnett, a seamstress and mother of 2, was found brutally murdered in her own home. Her children, traumatized beyond words, discovered her body in a scene that left investigators horrified. Heather's body had been mutilated, and her killer had left a chilling signature: clippings of her own hair, carefully placed in her hands. The cruelty and precision were unmistakable, a calculated act by someone who was both disturbed and deliberate. As detectives worked to unravel the mystery surrounding Heather's death, Restivo emerged as a person of interest. He had visited Heather's home previously, and Heather's children remembered that shortly after his visit, the family's house keys had mysteriously disappeared. There was an eerie familiarity to the crime, echoing whispers of Elisa Clapps's disappearance years earlier in Italy. Yet, despite the circumstantial connections, concrete evidence eluded investigators. Undeterred, detectives dug deeper into Restivo's life. What they uncovered painted a disturbing portrait of a man with a lifelong obsession. His disturbing behaviors had begun in childhood, and as a young boy, he'd reportedly suffered trauma from a failed tonsil surgery. Over the years, he exhibited increasingly strange and deviant behavior, often targeting women. Bournemouth residents reported unsettling encounters, recalling how he would sit behind schoolgirls on buses, snipping their hair with unsettling precision. One witness even described seeing him on a bus, masturbating to a woman's hair, an image that left investigators more convinced than ever that Restivo's twisted fixation went far beyond innocent oddity. Then came a breakthrough: forensic evidence. DNA residue linked Restivo to the scene of Heather Barnett's murder, but Restivo, calm and unnervingly composed, provided an explanation that initially seemed coherent enough to keep suspicion at bay. The case lingered on, shadowed by doubt, until a crucial discovery was made back in Italy. In 2010, the missing remains of Elisa Claps were discovered. Her body was found in the very church where she'd last been seen, hidden for nearly 2 decades. The state of her remains confirmed everyone's worst fears. Her hair had been cut and placed in her hands, a signature detail that paralleled Heather Barnett's murder in England. DNA analysis placed Restivo at the scene, finally linking him to Elisa's death with indisputable evidence. In 2011, justice prevailed as Restivo was convicted of both murders. The courtroom heard the details of his twisted obsessions, and Restivo was sentenced to life in prison. The evidence, finally, was undeniable. The case of Danilo Restivo is a chilling reminder of how certain fixations, left unchecked, can evolve into dark and violent obsessions. It serves as a warning of the terrible ways a disturbed mind can hide beneath the surface, waiting to reveal itself in unimaginable acts of cruelty. Number 7. Eric Kibbe and Magali Bamu. Witchcraft. In the summer of 2008, 19-year-old Naomi Ilonga traveled to London, expecting a simple family visit with her cousin, soccer coach Eric Kibbe, and his girlfriend, Magali Bamu. But what should have been a pleasant stay quickly spiraled into something far more sinister. Ilonga found herself the subject of Eric's paranoia. One day, without warning, he grabbed a pair of scissors and hacked off her long, flowing hair. The reason? To Eric, her habit of biting her nails was a sign of witchcraft, a mark of evil. But Ilonga, despite her shock and fear, emerged physically unharmed. She returned home, perhaps shaken, but she could not have known the depths of Eric's growing delusions. Sadly, others would not be as lucky. Fast forward to Christmas 2010. Christy Bamu, a bright 15-year-old from Paris, traveled with his 2 siblings to spend the holidays with his older sister Magali and her boyfriend, Eric. The siblings were excited to reconnect with Magali, but shortly after their arrival, Eric's suspicions reignited. Once again, he became convinced he was surrounded by witches. This time, however, it wasn't a matter of snipping hair. This time, he was certain Christy and his siblings were sorcerers, casting dark spells and curses over his household. In a rage, Eric enlisted Magali in his twisted campaign. They deprived Christy and his siblings of food, water, and sleep. The children were berated, accused, and beaten. After hours of brutal treatment, Christy and his siblings, desperate for any respite, began to confess to Eric's accusations, hoping it might ease the assault. But their words, rather than soothing him, fueled his hatred. The nightmare escalated, and Christy became Eric's primary target. During one horrific episode, Christy, terrified and exhausted, wet himself. That small, frightened act pushed Eric over the edge. He grabbed a hammer and smashed Christy's teeth, twisting the boy's ears with pliers, beating him with a metal rod, a paint roller, knives, and even a chisel. Christy's siblings watched helplessly, horror-stricken as their brother endured unimaginable pain. He cried, he begged, he called out to his sister Magali, asking her to stop Eric's brutality. But Magali, seemingly unfeeling, turned away from her brother's pleas and urged Eric to continue. The torture lasted for 3 unrelenting days. Each hour brought new torment until Christy, broken and defeated, found himself longing for death as his only escape. His last breaths came when Eric forced him into a so-called ritual bath, holding him underwater until he drowned. In court, Eric Kibbe attempted to explain away his actions, blaming brain lesions for his barbaric acts, while Magali claimed innocence, denying any involvement in the violence. But the evidence and testimony were overwhelming. The judge saw through their defenses, condemning Eric to a minimum of 30 years in prison and Magali to at least 25 years. The death of Christy Bamu became a symbol of the dangerous power of delusion, where misguided beliefs and unchecked paranoia turned to brutality and murder. It serves as a haunting reminder of the darkness that can hide within homes and within minds, unchecked, leaving even the most innocent vulnerable to horrific cruelty. Number 6. Ricky Brogsdale. Violent voyeurism. Ricky Brogsdale's life was shaped by pain and chaos from its earliest years. Raised by a mother known for her violent outbursts and alcohol addiction, Brogsdale grew up in an environment where neglect and abuse were daily realities. His early years were marked by constant instability, where nurturing was scarce and anger seemed to be the only language he knew. To cope, young Brogsdale found dangerous outlets. Drugs became a familiar refuge, and he began lashing out with violence, spiraling down a dark path that would only worsen over time. As a teenager, Brogsdale's actions became increasingly disturbing. He frequently found himself in juvenile detention for offenses ranging from battery to rape. But this confinement didn't reform him. It merely offered a temporary pause. By the time he reached adulthood, Brogsdale had developed a deeply ingrained obsession with voyeurism. His unsettling behavior would escalate into a fixation that blended voyeurism with violence, a combination that turned deadly. In May 1987, Brogsdale was granted parole after serving part of a sentence for possessing an unlicensed firearm. Despite his record, he was released, temporarily free until his trial. But only 2 months after his release, he was arrested again, this time for indecent exposure. Despite the repeat offense, the parole board chose leniency and allowed him to remain free until his trial instead of immediately revoking his parole. It was a decision that would come with tragic consequences. For the next 6 weeks, Brogsdale roamed the neighborhoods of southeast Washington, D.C. in a macabre ritual, preying on unsuspecting women. He would lurk in the shadows, peering through their windows, a peeping Tom who took pleasure in the helplessness of his chosen targets. Watching them wasn't enough. He would escalate, masturbating while he observed. But even this perverse act didn't fully satisfy his twisted need for control and power. In a chilling progression, Brogsdale's voyeurism turned lethal. He began to carry a firearm on his nightly prowls, and each time he saw a woman he had been watching, he would raise his gun and fire. Over the course of his 6-week spree, he shot 7 people, killing 2 of them. His crimes earned him the nickname Peeping Tom Killer, a label that captured only a fraction of the horror he inflicted on the women and families of D.C. The community was left in shock and fear as Brogsdale's terror spread through the city. His seemingly random predatory acts had everyone on edge, and his elusive nature made his capture a top priority for law enforcement. Police poured resources into tracking him down, desperate to stop the violence. When they finally captured him, they discovered that his motives were deeply entwined with his fractured past. During the trial, Brogsdale's defense painted him as a man tortured by his traumatic childhood, describing him as someone driven by a diseased hunger, born from years of neglect and abuse. They attempted to explain his twisted desire for control as a response to the pain he had endured throughout his life. But this reasoning did little to ease the agony of the families affected by his horrific actions. Survivors and relatives of those he had killed or maimed sat through the proceedings, watching as his attorneys argued that his violence was simply an extension of a life that had been broken from the start. The prosecution, however, left no doubt as to the gravity of his crimes. They presented him not just as a victim of his circumstances, but as a calculated predator, a man whose pleasure derived from wielding power over the helpless. His acts of violence were meticulously detailed, painting a picture of a man who reveled in his twisted rituals. The D.C. court found Ricky Brogsdale guilty of first-degree murder, sentencing him to 63 years in prison with the possibility of parole only after serving 55 years. The judge's words reflected the community's horror, condemning the senseless cruelty that had left so many lives shattered. Brogsdale's case served as a painful reminder of the dangers of unchecked leniency, as a fleeting decision by the parole board had allowed a predator to roam free, causing irreparable harm. To this day, the story of Ricky Brogsdale, the Peeping Tom killer, stands as a cautionary tale of how trauma left to fester, and parole decisions taken lightly can end in devastation, leaving lives and communities scarred in their wake. Number 5. David Tarloff. His mother. David Tarloff was well known in his neighborhood, often described as the crazy guy. In his youth, he had been slim and fashionable, but over time he succumbed to severe schizophrenia, transforming into a man barely recognizable from his former self. He became withdrawn and erratic, often disheveled, neglecting to fully button his shirts or zip his pants. His habits became odd and unpredictable. He'd steal cat food and yoo-hoo from a Manhattan grocery store, muttering to himself as he roamed the streets. At night, he could be heard shouting at his elderly mother, his voice echoing through the building walls. Yet beneath the chaos of his mind, Tarloff's love for his 73-year-old mother, Beatrice, ran deep. This intense attachment took a devastating toll when she was moved into a nursing home. For David, it was an unbearable separation. His grief spiraled into rage, and he'd visit her facility often, harassing the staff and even issuing threats. Eventually, they had no choice but to remove him from the premises. His father, increasingly concerned about David's volatility, moved Beatrice to other facilities, hoping for peace, but David always found her. As his mental state unraveled, those close to him grew increasingly alarmed. Family members and the police made multiple attempts to have him committed to a psychiatric facility, recognizing the danger he posed. Yet, due to the revolving door system for mental health admissions, David was repeatedly released after brief stays, despite showing clear signs of escalating instability. David became convinced that his mother was being mistreated in these facilities, a delusion that fueled his desperation to rescue her. He developed a crude plan, dreaming of whisking her away to Hawaii, or even another country where he imagined they'd find peace together. But for his scheme, he needed money, and he knew exactly who he would target to get it. David's mind fixated on Dr. Kent Shinbach, a psychiatrist who had once hospitalized him back in 1991. Blaming Shinbach for his past confinement, David decided he would rob the psychiatrist's office, hoping to gather enough funds to carry out his escape with his mother. But when he entered the Manhattan office building, It wasn't Dr. Shinbach he encountered. Instead, David came face to face with therapist Catherine Fogay, a woman he had never met. Panic surged through him, and his plan dissolved into a violent frenzy. In a horrific attack, he assaulted Dr. Fogay, stabbing her 15 times with a meat cleaver and striking her head with a mallet, unleashing years of pent-up rage and delusion onto an innocent woman. The brutal murder left New York City in shock, and in the aftermath, mental health professionals examined Tarloff's competency. 3 separate times he was deemed incompetent to stand trial, his mind so fractured that he could barely understand the gravity of his actions. But in 2014, 6 years after Dr. Fogay's tragic death, a jury finally found him guilty of second-degree murder and related charges. David Tarloff's tragic life came to a close in the courtroom, where he was sentenced to spend the rest of his days behind bars. His story underscores the perils of untreated mental illness, of a flawed system that released a troubled man back into society time and time again, leaving one innocent life lost and countless others forever scarred by the consequences. Number 4. Craig Hicks, Parking Spaces. Craig Hicks was a man whose life seemed built on anger, obsession, and an unrelenting need for control. Known by many as intense and confrontational, his simmering rage was often triggered by the smallest infractions. Hicks found dark satisfaction in his favorite movie, Falling Down, a story about a man's descent into violence and revenge. He watched it obsessively, laughing at scenes of chaos and finding disturbing amusement in the carnage. Those who knew him described Hicks as an outspoken atheist, often using his disdain for religion to provoke arguments with those around him. But his most notorious fixation was far more mundane: parking spaces. At his Chapel Hill, North Carolina apartment complex, the 46-year-old Hicks was infamous for his obsession with parking regulations. Neighbors quickly learned that Hicks policed the complex's parking area with militant precision, logging the details of every vehicle's location, monitoring cars without proper parking stickers, and reporting even minor violations. He confronted neighbors with relentless persistence, escalating even the smallest perceived infractions into full-blown conflicts. His self-appointed role as parking enforcer only grew as he clashed with neighbors. Hicks once reported a couple for engaging in intimate acts in a parked car and inundated a local towing company with so many calls for violations that they eventually banned him from using their service. For many, Hicks's intensity was unsettling, even frightening. His neighbors grew increasingly wary of him. This was particularly true for Dea Barakat, a 23-year-old dental student, his wife, Yusor Mohammed Abu Salha, and her younger sister, Razan. Hicks had harassed the young couple repeatedly, confronting them over what he perceived as parking violations. Sometimes he would approach them while openly carrying a gun, making his accusations even more intimidating. Other times, he would barge into their apartment, complaining about noise or other minor grievances, escalating his anger with each encounter. As the harassment continued, Dia attempted to avoid further confrontations by creating a printed parking map for his guests, hoping this measure would appease Hicks, but it seemed nothing could satisfy him. The couple's efforts at peace only underscored Hicks's obsession. His fixation on control grew darker, as did his disdain toward the couple, fueled by what many, including the victims' families, believed to be religious bias. To Dia, Yusor, and Razan, Hicks wasn't just an obsessive neighbor, he was a looming threat. In February 2015, their worst fears came to life. Hicks entered Dia and Yusor's apartment, and in a horrifying act of rage, fatally shot Dia, Yusor, and Razan. The community was left in shock. 3 young lives were taken in an instant, and the senseless brutality of the act left family members and friends grieving an unimaginable loss. Hicks's actions ignited public outrage, with many believing the murders were motivated by religious hatred. Dea, Yusor, and Razan were Muslim, and their families felt that Hicks's constant harassment had been rooted in anti-Muslim prejudice. The legal proceedings that followed exposed Hicks's troubled past and intense rage. His attorneys attempted to argue that the killings had stemmed from a long-standing parking dispute, claiming his actions were rooted in a need for control rather than religious bias. But the victims' families, as well as many in the community, felt differently, calling for hate crime charges and drawing attention to the impact of unchecked religious and racial bias. The tragedy sent ripples through Chapel Hill and far beyond, sparking conversations about hate crime legislation and bias-motivated violence. Hicks's actions highlighted the disturbing ways in which everyday conflicts, when fueled by obsessive anger and prejudice, can spiral into acts of violence. His story also cast a light on the perils of ignored warning signs, as Hicks's behavior had often crossed the line from simple complaints to outright intimidation, a danger recognized too late. Craig Hicks now serves a life sentence, a small measure of justice for a crime that left 3 young lives cut short and a community forever changed. His story serves as a haunting reminder of how seemingly trivial obsessions can conceal a deadly darkness, one that can shatter lives in an instant. The senseless loss of Dea, Yusor, and Razan has left an indelible mark, a symbol of the need for vigilance, understanding, and the fight against prejudice in all its forms. Number 3. Harry Street, Noisy Neighbors. Harry Street was more than just an irritable old man. To his neighbors, he was a living nightmare. Known for his volatile temper and unpredictable rages, Street's constant harassment, late-night drilling, and verbal assaults created a hostile environment that left residents around him on edge. Warren Smith, one of Street's unfortunate neighbors in Birmingham, England, experienced the worst of his outbursts. Objects flew from Street's yard onto Smith's property. Furious pounding and drilling would fill the night as Street berated anyone who dared to disturb his version of peace. In 2013, Smith had had enough and moved away, hoping for some reprieve. But Street wasn't ready to let him go. He stalked Smith to his new home, amplifying his harassment. When police finally intervened, what they found shocked the community to its core. Harry Street wasn't merely a hostile neighbor. He was Barry Williams, a name that had once terrorized the nation. Back in 1978, Barry Williams had unleashed unimaginable violence on his neighborhood. His fury was born out of an extreme sensitivity to noise, a paranoia that convinced him that sounds from neighbors' cars and televisions were mocking him. Street's mind twisted ordinary, everyday sounds into targeted slights. When a car engine revved or a television played too loudly, he interpreted it as deliberate personal ridicule. The quiet paranoia simmered within him, each perceived insult feeding a delusional belief that his neighbors were conspiring against him. On October 26, 1978, Williams's delusions reached a horrifying climax. That evening, his neighbors were outside working on their car. The sound of their voices and the occasional clink of tools shattered his thin hold on sanity. Unable to endure what he saw as intentional torment, Williams grabbed 2 handguns, stormed outside, and began shooting. He killed his neighbors, then turned his rage onto more nearby residents, leaving a total of 5 people dead and others wounded in a rampage that spanned several homes. As police pursued him, Williams continued his path of destruction, tossing homemade explosives from his car and shooting at bystanders. By the time he was apprehended, the once quiet neighborhood lay in shock, forever marked by his violence. Williams was found mentally unfit for prison and was instead committed to a psychiatric facility where he spent the next 15 years. The authorities, convinced he was rehabilitated, released him in 1994. Upon release, he changed his name to Harry Street and moved on, or so it seemed. The transformation into Harry Street offered only the illusion of change. Beneath the surface, Williams's paranoia and anger lingered, lying dormant for years before erupting again. The old habits returned, and the same disturbing behaviors began to emerge: arguments with neighbors, obsessive noise complaints, and hostile confrontations. Warren Smith became his new fixation. Over time, the harassment intensified until Street's presence grew unbearable for Smith, who sought refuge by moving away. But even a new address couldn't keep Street's rage at bay. Police intervention in 2013 brought Street's terrifying secret to light. A search of his home uncovered bullets, gunpowder, and components for explosives, signaling that he had been meticulously planning for another possible attack. Authorities realized with horror that they were dealing with the same Barry Williams who had wreaked havoc decades earlier. The community was left reeling, and for many who remembered 1978, the memories of his killing spree came flooding back. Street was recommitted to a psychiatric institution in 2014, deemed too dangerous to remain free. He died shortly afterward, bringing an end to a life marred by violence and paranoia. His story serves as a harrowing reminder of how untreated delusions and unchecked aggression can devastate lives. Even under a new identity, his deeply rooted rage persisted, leaving a trail of fear and loss spanning decades. Harry Street, once Barry Williams, is a tragic example of how unresolved mental illness and paranoid obsession can lead to destruction. His life, and the lives of those he tormented, stand as a cautionary tale, underscoring the need for vigilance, support, and early intervention when signs of dangerous behavior emerge. Number 2. Tulsa's sex maniac, necrophilia. Between 1942 and 1948, fear seeped into the very fabric of Tulsa, Oklahoma. In the dead of night, 4 women, ages 19 to 48, were brutally murdered in their own beds, beaten to death by a faceless intruder. The killer's shadow haunted the city, and his twisted methods earned him the chilling nickname of the sex maniac. For 6 long years, the women of Tulsa lived with an ever-present fear, never knowing if they, too, would fall victim to his brutality. The killer's modus operandi was as horrifying as it was specific. He would strike under the cover of darkness, entering homes unseen and making his way to the bedroom. There, armed with a pipe or another blunt object, he would bludgeon his victim, delivering blow after blow with merciless force, often shattering their skulls. But his violence didn't end there. In an act of depravity, he defiled the bodies of his victims, revealing the depths of his perverse cruelty. And in 2 of the 4 murders, the killer took his time, preparing a meal for himself as if the home were his own. In one instance, he scrambled and ate 7 eggs, leaving behind a scene both brutal and bizarre. Yet despite the killer's audacity, the evidence he left behind was sparse. Authorities found no fingerprints or footprints, only traces of gray hair and grease smudges on the victim's bedding. In an era before DNA profiling, these clues offered little hope. As the murders went on, the community grew restless, their trust in law enforcement waning as each investigation stalled. By 1945, the pressure on Tulsa's police force to deliver answers was overwhelming, and in their desperation, they pinned the murders on Leroy Benton, a 33-year-old African-American man. After days of intense coercive interrogation, Benton confessed, though his confession lacked crucial details and contained numerous inconsistencies. Under the weight of a forced admission, Benton was convicted, but an appellate judge later overturned the conviction, citing the brutal interrogation tactics used to extract the confession. Benton was released, and Tulsa's sex maniac remained at large, a shadow lurking in the minds of every woman in the city. Years passed, and the investigation ground to a near halt, leaving residents with a nagging sense of vulnerability. Then, in 1948, police received a tip that led them to a new suspect, 52-year-old Charles Floyd. Floyd had a reputation for erratic behavior and fit the psychological profile of a man capable of such heinous acts. Authorities tracked him down, and in a dramatic confrontation conducted in front of a news reporter, Floyd confessed, recounting details that seemed to finally answer the questions haunting Tulsa. The confession should have brought peace to the city, but the case took another turn. Floyd was evaluated by a psychiatrist who diagnosed him as a deranged murderer, but concluded he was unfit to stand trial. Instead of a court sentence, Floyd was committed to a mental hospital where he would spend the rest of his life. No formal charges were ever filed, and no official conviction was made. The case was left unresolved, and for the families of the victims, justice remained elusive. The legacy of Tulsa's sex maniac remains one of the city's darkest and most unsettling mysteries. The brutal nature of the crimes, coupled with the murky justice system that attempted to close the case with forced confessions, left the community shaken and mistrustful. The case stands as a stark reminder of a time when justice was tenuous, and fear governed the lives of those who longed for an answer that never truly came. Number 1. Dayton Leroy Rogers, Feet and Bondage. Dayton Leroy Rogers was only 18 when he showed his first signs of cruelty. One evening, he asked a 15-year-old girl to close her eyes, promising her a surprise. In a sudden, unprovoked attack, he stabbed her in the stomach. For Rogers, this was a spontaneous act of violence, a thrill he pursued without remorse, a dark hint of the brutal path he would follow. It was the beginning of a life fueled by a fetish for violence, bondage, and a fixation on women's feet that would escalate into the realm of murder. Throughout his early adult years, Rogers's deviant urges only grew. He began picking up women, typically vulnerable heroin-addicted prostitutes, whom he would lure in with promises of quick cash or companionship. His process became a sick ritual. After paying for their trust and convincing them to let him fondle their feet, he would move on to far more sinister acts. Once he had them alone, Rogers would hogtie his victims, transforming their vulnerability into helpless captivity. It was during these moments, with his prey immobilized, that his darkest urges would surface. Rogers's obsession with feet became his signature. He would bite and maul his victims' feet and other body parts in fits of violent passion. In some instances, his violence escalated further. He would saw their feet clean off. His cruelty was methodical, mixing physical and psychological abuse to break his victims' spirits. He would slam their heads against hard surfaces, verbally degrade them, slap them around, and revel in their cries of pain. The more they screamed, the more excited he became. For Rogers, the terror and agony of his victims were the ultimate fuel for his twisted desires. By the late 1980s, Rogers's sadism had escalated into outright murder. In 1988, his violence spilled into public view when he fatally stabbed Jennifer Smith outside an Oregon restaurant. The brutal killing shook the community and brought Rogers's crimes to light, but this was far from his only murder. In the months that followed, authorities began to uncover more bodies, each one offering a glimpse into the mind of a sadistic killer with a unique and horrifying fetish. Rogers's victims bore the marks of his obsessions: feet bitten or sawed off, bodies hog-tied and battered, the aftermath of his need for domination and control. Rogers's perversion wasn't just about physical brutality. His rituals included disembowelment and mutilation, leaving bodies in a state of horror that baffled even seasoned investigators. In one particularly gruesome case, he disemboweled a victim from her pelvis to her sternum. By the time authorities pieced together his crimes, Rogers had claimed the lives of at least 8 women, with over a dozen others who had managed to escape his sadistic grip, carrying the weight of their traumatic experiences. Despite the overwhelming evidence and the chilling brutality of his crimes, Rogers fought relentlessly to avoid the death penalty. Over the years, he managed to evade capital punishment 3 times on various legal technicalities, each appeal a reminder of his unwillingness to face justice. In 2015, after years of delays and legal battles, an Oregon jury sentenced Rogers to death for a 4th time. It was a sentence that many hoped would finally mark the end of his evasive maneuvers. Dayton Leroy Rogers' case stands as one of the most disturbing chapters in Oregon's history. His crimes reveal a man who thrived on the pain of others, whose violent desires were interwoven with a dark obsession that led to the suffering of countless victims. His story serves as a stark reminder of how deeply perverse fixations can drive unimaginable cruelty, leaving a legacy of terror and trauma for those who survived and those left behind. Thank you for joining me on Creepshow. These real-life cases of obsession and violence remind us of the terrifying extremes to which the human mind can sometimes descend. If these stories left you unsettled, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you're here for every dive into the darkest corners of true crime. Share your thoughts on these chilling cases in the comments, and let me know if there are other twisted minds you'd like to hear about. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, some obsessions are better left unexplored.